Evolution, Lesson 3.3, Speciation. So now that we have a really good understanding of genetic variation, evolution in populations, and natural selection, we start to go a little bit deeper and start to understand sort of the really deep interactions of different animals and species and stuff like that before and during evolution. So speciation is the origin of new species, and then we sort of have this microevolution and macroevolution. So microevolutions are adaptations on a small scale below the species level. So yeah, that's sort of self-explanatory. It's small, micro, and then macroevolution are adaptations on a large scale above the species level. So macro above. And then there's just a picture of, like we talked about before, the Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. So there are sort of two basic patterns that we're going to look at, which is anagenesis and cladogenesis. So anagenesis transforms one species to another. It's phyletic evolution. And cladogenesis is the splitting of a gene pool, and if you remember, we talked about what a gene pool was before, to give rise to one new species. This is the only thing that can promote biological diversity. And if you think back to our first unit, we talked about why biological diversity is important, and this is the only thing that can also increase the number of species. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of what speciation is, we can start to look at it. So like I said, speciation is the origin of new species. So origin basically means like a new species comes about. How does a new species come about? Well, reproduction has to occur. But sort of evolution and natural selection over time, and basically speciation, over time, reproductive barriers have been put into place. And sometimes this can be a really good thing, and sometimes this can be a not so good thing. But essentially, there are two types of barriers, prezygotic and postzygotic, and they both essentially impede a baby from being born. That's essentially it. Or they impede new trees from developing somewhere. They impede butterflies from making or flowers being fertilized somewhere. That's essentially what it is. So prezygotic gets in the way of fertilization occurring by impeding the actual mating, so like impeding the two species actually mating or the fertilization. Postzygotic is, so they miss the prezygotic one and fertilization already happened, you can't do anything about it, but it can stop the actual zygote from developing into a viable offspring. So and it's important to remember that these don't always happen. It's sort of sometimes thing, sometimes not thing. So let's break it down. Prezygotic. So there are 5 types of prezygotic barriers. So the first one is habitat isolation, pretty self-explanatory. Sort of the habitat gets isolated away from each other. What can you do? You actually separate the two animals so they can no longer mate. Temporal isolation is they breed at different times of the year. What are you going to do? Behavioral isolation, so sort of like courtship behaviors, like, oh, like I want to mate with you, no I don't, stuff like that. Mechanical isolation, like physically separating them. And then gamma isolation, which is the sperm of one species can't fertilize eggs of another. It's just not scientifically possible. Then we have postzygotic, which we already talked about, which has 3. So reduced hybrid viability, which is genes that different parent species interact and impair hybrids' development. Reduced hybrid fertility is even if the hybrid's viable, it may they may be sterile. So like the baby won't be able to develop further. It's not fertile anymore. And then hybrid breakdown is essentially first the hybrid may be viable and then it may not be. So essentially like meiosis fails to carry out. That's essentially what that is. So Now that we know what speciation is, how does it actually occur? So 2 ways. Allopatric speciation is when a new species forms while geographically isolated from the parent population. So you'd see the mountains are obviously impeding. It is a geographical isolation. And then sympatric speciation is the reproductive barriers isolate a subset of the population without geographically separating from the parent species. So you sort of see those trees, those light green ones, they're not separated from the parent species, but it is making it rather hard for them. And then we sort of have the tempo of speciation. So punctuated equilibrium, which means it can happen sort of like apparently like boom, go, boom, go, boom, go, like a sudden change. And then we have gradual equilibrium, which obviously contracts punctual equilibrium, and it happens slowly over time. And that's it for speciation.